Part of this job is studying different societies around the world and trying to figure out what's going to happen next to them. In the back of my head, I keep a metric. How much fodder does your society have for a revolution? It includes stuff like a weak power system, arbitrary and cruel governance, economic problems and popular wars, the military's loyalties, etc. Through going through all of these metrics, and for reasons I'll explain through this video, Russia is one of the countries, and the biggest major country in the world alongside China, which scores highest on if it'll have a revolution in the next 5 years. This is a video to talk about the collapse of modern Russia. This is a video I've been wanting to make for a long time, at least for the last year since the start of the war in Ukraine. However, I've been too busy and/or lazy to actually get along to doing it. Now I've actually done the research, and I'm excited to see what you folks think. As a content creator, I constantly have to worry about getting hacked or having my personal information leaked online with people who disagree with me. Thankfully, I have Optory to automatically detect and remove my personal info whenever it's detected by the internet. Optory is a data removal service that helps prevent hackers, stalkers, and corporations taking advantage of my personal information. Optory scans and removes your home address, phone, and other private info from hundreds of data broker sites. Data brokers buy and sell information about you from your social media activity, government records like your driver's license, or even in-person places you visit. By removing your info from these sites, you're making it much more difficult for criminals, spammers, and big tech companies to get a hold of your personal info. I personally signed up and started my free exposure risk scan, and it showed that my data appeared on 46 data broker sites that I had never even heard of before. Anyone can sign up for free to start their exposure risk scan and see which sites are storing their information, as well as get free detailed instructions to DIY their own deletion requests to data brokers. If you prefer to have Optory's robots do deletion requests for you, you can upgrade to Optory's paid plans, which start at $3.99 a month. You can also get an extra 20% off any plan by using the promo code Rudyard. Protect your online privacy and sign up for Optory.com today. I'd bet a good amount of money that modern Russia will not survive the next 5 years. As I always like to say through these videos, my job is betting against God, and there are an infinite amount of ways to be wrong, and only a handful to be right. Thus, I don't have complete knowledge of Russia's future, but I am confident the fall of Russia is soon. Through this video, we will investigate the factors leading to this, and hear how the modern Russian social order was established as a reaction to the fall of the Soviet Union. Through that, we can see why this social order doesn't have the legs to stand on for much longer. Today's Russia exists in the shadow of the fall of the Soviet Union, and so to understand how modern Russia works, it's important to see the conditions that Russia had right after the fall of the USSR, which reflect the current political and social structure better than the actual conditions today. When the Soviet Union self-imploded, the assumption among the communist elite who made that transition was that Russia, simply by adopting the right policies, could become a wealthy, capitalist, free society like those in Western Europe. However, that turned out to be completely untrue. As I've talked about in my video on Orthodox civilization and the economy, the success of certain economic and political policies is contingent upon the society's social structure and development. The thing is that in the Western world, there's a 1,000+ year history of the development of various non-government institutions such as a free market, church, civic associations, democracy, or more. This means that if you surrender power from the state, that society has evolved various techniques on how to manage it. Remember, human societies are living, breathing things that need training in the same way a human muscle does, or how you need to train on a certain skill like riding a bike or being a responsible person for years. What occurred under Stalinism was that the centralized communist government butchered every other major social institution. Human societies take centuries or thousands of years to build their social institutions, and the Soviets torched the Russian aristocracy, military officers, church, family, merchant class, independent farmers, and every other social organism. Stalin then went out killing other members of the Communist Party. That means that the only social group left in the Soviet Union were the secret police who were used to ruthlessly destroy the rest of the culture. Writing episodes like this is kind of strange since I'm shoving multiple layers of complexity together and just vastly different timescales. With what we're going to see play out in Russia soon is a combination of minute short-term decisions that will change the course of history alongside trends that have been taking centuries to build up and release now. That's how the real world is, though. However, one of the things that in researching this video I found is that Russia, alongside other former communist societies like China, are the least culturally dense places on the planet. What that means is that they've completely stripped away any traditions and sense of cultural unity that allow those societies to prosper in healthy ways. I'm going to get into this point in much greater depth later, but a society that believes in nothing is completely doomed on every level. The thing with all of these threads is that since the Soviets had hollowed out Russian society so much that with the fall of communism, what occurred after was complete social breakdown. I know it's a meme on this show where I constantly shit on communism for being the worst political ideology ever, but life for the average Russian after the fall of the Soviet Union was hell. The fall of the Soviet Union felt like an apocalypse for normal Russians. Russia went from one of the great world powers to a failed state in a handful of years. It also occurred very abruptly, where only the smartest or luckiest analysts were predicting the Soviet Union's fall in 1987, let alone the average Russian citizen who was listening to state propaganda. Russia was a society where most people lived as serfs and clans for centuries, and with the Soviet Union, the state provided the stability that they lost with the end of serfdom. However, with the breakdown of the state, it felt like complete social collapse. It's difficult for us to fathom how horrifying this was in the West, especially since it occurred in the 1990s, or which seem like a really recent and normie time period to us today. One of the shared themes that we're going to see across this video is that modern Russia acts in many ways like a medieval country. It's ironic I've said the exact same thing at the modern US, but it's for the opposite reasons. Putin's rise to power is the sort of thing you'd hear about in medieval China or Germany. The really funny thing about Stalinism is that by the time it was done, the only functioning social institution were the secret police, since someone had to carry out Stalin's orders. In the same way where the warrior-slave Mamelukes often became the rulers themselves in the medieval Middle East, as communism fell apart, the secret police put themselves into power. Also, in the Soviet Union, there were two power cliques that dominated national politics, the Leningrad and Ukrainian factions. As Ukraine gained independence, is it any surprise that a secret policeman from Leningrad got power? Putin got into power through a combination of his own talents and luck. It's a complicated story that the book All of the Kremlin's Men by Mikhail Zygar talks about, where he was a combination of very capable, but also not assuming or threatening enough for other people in the structure to whack him down. He moved from being the leader of the secret police to replacing the failed civilian government under Yeltsin peacefully and consensually. Much like a medieval king, he was partially placed into power, since he wasn't seen as a threat to entrenched interests. But once he did get into power, he proved his durability and independence. Putin's Russia gains most of its popularity from what happened after this. Putin generally pulled Russia together from collapse. He was able to put down the long-standing revolt in Chechnya by establishing a feudal relationship with the local lord, where they are fed an exorbitant amount of money. He was able to stabilize the Russian economy, pulling the average Russian from degrading poverty to comfortable working class, even creating a sizable international middle class. After this point in the early 2000s, which globally was the best period of growth ever in human history, Russia did incredibly well. This was largely since resource prices were very high due to the developing world, and especially China was growing so rapidly. At this point, Russia appeared to its own inhabitants and outsiders as a sort of Roman Principate, a calm, responsible dictatorship that wasn't that far from being a democracy, but was also set up for massive economic and social growth. However, in 2014, global resource prices crashed, and what people saw was that the Russians hadn't invested any of their money from high resource prices into long-standing industries that could operate besides that. And the exact same process occurred in Brazil. And you really see the Russia that exists today come about in the aftermath of the collapse of global resource prices in 2014. The 2008 financial crisis was a giant turning point for Russia, because beforehand, Putin's calculation was that the West would help grow their economy and for them to develop as a society. And Putin had very strong relationships with Western leaders, including Tony Blair in Britain, because the West thought that Russia would become a democracy, and they viewed Putin as the person who would shepherd that process. However, after 2008, the Russians made the calculation that the West wasn't everything it was chalked up to be, because they just blew up their own economies. And Russia then went through a process of separating itself from the West and pushing for its foreign policy in exchange for losing potential economically through integrating through the West. And we start to see Russia's wars in Georgia and Crimea, and the mindset that got Russia into the current Ukraine war in a lot of ways started in the aftermath of 2008, as the Russians realized that they would have to protect their own interests because the West was not an all-abiding God that could supply them all the answers. Another book I got a lot from for this video is Fragile Empire by Ben Judah. One of the points that really struck me is how weird the Russian ruling class is today. If you look at the inner circle Vladimir Putin surrounds himself with, or the people he gives important government positions to, who own the old, massive Soviet state-owned companies, they're just random friends from his hometown. You'll get crazy stories like the guy who just used to sell Putin chemical equipment now builds his palaces. A good friend who he'd grab lunch with and worked as a lawyer, Medvedev, was president while Putin sat down for a few years. Putin's friends and colleagues from earlier in his life are now the new nobility, in the same way that when William the Conqueror took over England, the lord of some parish by Dol de Bretagne is now the Duke of York. This is really important to think about and emblematic of the biggest problem that faces Russia today, that being the complete lack of social trust. In high-trust societies like the US, Denmark, or Japan, people until recently trusted their government, neighbors, institutions, or politicians, at least to a degree where they expected them to perform their duty and not do massive corruption. Russia is such a low-trust society that Putin only feels safe with those who are completely reliant on him, or those who would be nobodies without their personal connections to him, and are thus in charge. Even then, he doesn't really trust them to close to the same degree as a Western politician would trust the members of another political party. Politics in Russia today mirrors that of a medieval European country. It's hard to read the politics of the Second World or former communist countries in the West today partially on a purely cultural basis. People communicate about power in basically the opposite ways in Western from non-Western societies. However, also it's not about political parties or mobilization in the public like it is in the West, rather like the Wars of the Roses or Game of Thrones, with different nobles having very personal ties, which determine their political alliances, which are constantly shifting under the hood and discreet until the swords finally come out. Be clear that I, and really no one, actually knows what's going on in Russia now. Partially that since this society is not transparent with Western journalists. However, the political divide cuts across the hearts of individuals until everything falls apart. The other major part of the Russian elite besides Putin's nobility are the oligarchs. Again, like a medieval country where oftentimes local officials or army commanders would declare themselves nobility when the central government fell apart, the oligarchs tended to be old Communist Party officials who bought out the Soviet state companies during the fall. This was done really corruptly, with the auctions for these companies often being held at 3 a.m. in the middle of the woods, so that only those who were in the know could buy them. Since society was falling apart, they often bought these companies for nothing, only for them to become some of the richest people in the world afterwards. Under the Tsars, the Tsar would play a shell game where he'd either work with the nobility to hold down the population, or be the protector of the people against the nobility. This is what Putin's done. He keeps the oligarchs around and works with them given they centralize power in a way that's useful for him to control society. The oligarchs support the current order since it leaves them incredibly wealthy and powerful. He also periodically destroys oligarchs and shames them to garner support from the general population. In all the books I've been reading for this video, one theme keeps on coming up again and again. Modern Russia doesn't make any sense. That statement means multiple things on different levels. People in the West like to imagine that they are the endpoint for soulless consumerism, modernism, atheism, postmodernism, or irony. The truth, however, is that these are pushed much, much further in the former communist or second world. In a lot of ways, the West is more traditional than Russia or China, with more leftovers from older cultural forms like politeness, religion, or social structures. If you want to see what modernity looks like pushed to an extreme, go to China. One of my favorite themes here comes from the book Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. It's about a guy who worked as a film producer in Russia for over a decade, and he talks about Putin's propaganda machine. The thing is, as a person who does work in media full-time, I actually have profound admiration for how Putin structured his propaganda. Russia has mastered postmodern propaganda. The Russian government purposely sets up controlled oppositions that are dissenting enough to attract people and keep them agitated without actually doing anything. The Putin government is created around a dozen opposition parties. The Russian media will take a series of completely contradictory positions from different points of view in the same day. This succeeds at basically supplying the public with whatever they want without providing a single coherent thing for them to get angry at and rally around. This is propaganda that's perfect for manipulating young people who don't believe in anything. The media control of Russia is just through the news media. Written media and the internet are largely free. The calculation here was that you have to let out steam for the educated classes that tend to launch revolutions, while the normies who actually fight in them can just watch TV. The Russians didn't see the internet as a big deal when it was being formed, which meant it was able to get too big for them to regulate it. The Russian government's lack of control over the internet will probably be its downfall. Russia suffers Europe's PTSD the worst of anyone. If you look at Europe, you see a society that doesn't really know what it's going to believe in and is dying of ennui. Europe has tried following God, nationalism, leftism, and humanitarianism only to see each fail. Russia has done this the most of anyone. Russia is one of the countries that has had the most trauma ever from a combination of serfdom, the Mongols, the communists, or world wars. PTSD, as I can say from personal experience sadly, breaks up people's senses of time. The world seems chopped up into little discrete pieces that can't be put together. This is why I call Russia the broken mirror. This is shown in Russian media, and as you'll see, the government. Russia is a series of discordant pieces that don't really know how to fit together. The ruling ideology in Russia now is cynicism, but that just doesn't work for the long term. If you dig into what the Russian ruling class really believes, the short answer is nothing. They support the regime since they don't have a better choice. It's a society stuck in time, incapable of seeing its place in future or history. Societies like this fall apart and break under pressure. Russia is one of the weakest and most fragile societies in the world on a cultural basis. The Putin regime makes a big political statement of standing for the vertical of power. This is an idea that Putin has of a vertical line of power like an elevator that theoretically stretches from any local police officer, provincial governor, or mayor. It also goes the other way, where if there's a local complaint, it will go up to the good czar who will hear and redress the issues that are happening on a local basis. The vertical of power is a popular image for the Russian regime, since the reality is the opposite. Russia, like a medieval country, is incredibly decentralized. Local bosses have large amounts of power that the centralized government can't remove. Russian institutions like the local bureaucracy, army, police, or gangs operate under their own rule, with the government only being able to distantly adjust them. But we've run the Soviet experiment of extreme top-down authority, and the Russians have collectively rejected that, and there's nothing the centralized government can use to motivate people to follow them with their hearts. Russia today is like a Latin American country in a geography where that doesn't work. In Russia, there is no shared social trust, and people try to navigate a low-trust environment where everyone is out for themselves. In Russia, you often have to pay bribes to drive your car around town, pass a test, avoid conscription, get a driving permit, or start your business. This is how Brazil or Mexico work. But they keep operating since they're in the tropics, where even if you fail, you won't freeze to death over the winter. And also since they don't have any external threats. In cold Russia, which is stuck in the center of the map, you need to have a functioning society to a much greater degree. The Russians are aware in their souls that once they become incompetent, they get conquered, and that weighs on them heavily because it's happened too many times to count. When I look at modern Russia, I see less a country that is actively trying to drive its people into the dirt so they snap back, and rather a regime which just doesn't have enough stakeholders to keep it operating. Russia is one of the most unequal societies in the world, in range with Latin American countries. This means there are a few who are dazzlingly wealthy, and most are poor and have no stake in the society. Russia hasn't really recovered as a real economy since the fall of the Soviet Union. Soviet industries weren't competitive, which meant that when capitalism and globalization got into Russia, the factories and other such jobs just shut down. Russia instead evolved from being a European industrialized country to more like a Saudi Arabia or Brazil, completely dependent upon resource exports to the rest of the world. In Russia's case, this was oil, natural gas, various minerals, and food. This is a horrible position to be in, given these countries tend to have wildly fluctuating fortunes based off global markets, which tend to soar and then crash and then again. These countries kind of act like heroin addicts, alternating between blowing money in insane ways in the highs, and then collapsing in the bad times. Industrial countries tend to be pretty stably wealthy over time. However, the other side of this is that, like Brazil or Saudi Arabia, since the economy is driven by a handful of export industries owned by the very wealthy, it means you're not really sure what the rest of the population does. Russia doesn't really have industries that normal people work in. There are a lot of pensioners and people doing odd jobs. That's not a good place to be, since it creates a giant underclass of people who don't have anything better to do except rebel. In economics, there's a term for good and bad billionaires, where a good billionaire is one who made their own money through their own efforts rather than inheritance, and in industries that demand growth for the entire rest of the society. I'm not making this as a statement of the morality of the people involved, but a country like America, 80% of the billionaires made the money through their own efforts, and also 80% did it through industries which grew the total economy, such as tech, manufacturing, and things that require innovation, while in Russia it's the opposite, where the vast majority operate in industries that basically section off and rent part of the economy through state-controlled companies, mining, and this creates a sense of envy against the rich in Russia, which isn't comparable in many Western societies. Even for the people at the top, they don't trust the regime. The Russian elite has been trying to flee for over a decade. There are more Russian rubles or currency sitting in bank accounts outside Russia, in places like London, Panama, or Cyprus, than there is actual money circulating in the country of Russia. The Russian elite will probably get delusional, thinking if they remove Putin, they can make Russia a pure plutocracy where the oligarchs run everything, like Ukraine. However, they will fail to see how Putin restrains the mob from killing them. Let's compare this with China. China is now more in the Stalin school of dictatorship rather than the current Russian model, which is more like a medieval or Latin American dictatorship. China is now a Maoist state where the government has massive secret police presence, where the government's very overweening. This would be a good future video, but the Chinese government now is actively grinding their people into the ground and basically telling them to suck it up. However, at the same time, the Communist Party of China has more legitimacy than Putin's Russia. I don't think any of you can even name what political party Putin's part of. I read a bunch of books on this subject, and I forget it now. The Communist Party of China liberated China from the century of foreign humiliations, ushered in the most rapid economic growth ever in human history, made China a great power with allies on every continent. On top of this, the Chinese Communist Party is a really powerful ruling bloc, with 90 million members that supposedly have a strong shared ideology. The coming crisis in China will be much louder and bloodier than that in Russia, given the pressure from both sides is just much stronger, with the combination of the stronger regime putting more pressure onto the population. Russia's collapse is going to be much more confusing. No one can really explain what happened in the Second Congo or fall of Rome. There was just a point when the center lost legitimacy and everything unraveled. Russia is such a low-pressure environment that I see the vertical of power collapsing in the next few years, as Russia falls into feudal states and warlords. A major problem for this video is that the sources on what's going on in Russia are absent in the West. I'm basically guessing for the post-Ukraine war period. However, the underlying variables make me confident that Russia is going to fall apart. One of the biggest factors is demographics. Russia is one of the worst demographics of any country on the planet. Russia has the same life expectancy as Papua New Guinea. This is one tip-off for me that the society's broken. The reason Russia has such a low life expectancy is not from infant mortality like you'd see in pre-modern or third world countries. It's since middle-aged men are drinking themselves to death from hopelessness. Russia is one of the worst aging problems in the world and one of the lowest birth rates. Russia is a society where its inhabitants are trying to leave it as soon as possible through dying and are unwilling to bring more people into it. Analysts like Peter Zeihan or George Friedman have been saying for years that Russia would collapse in the early 2020s due to these demographic trends finally getting to headway. The thing people fail to understand with aging is that it holistically affects the entire society. Less young people means less people working to support the elderly, less people having children, which makes the problem compound. On top of this, an older population will make conservative policies that won't be able to adapt to change. An aging population is social death by 1,000 cuts. If you look at Russia, you find that their demographics are very similar to China. They have a giant generation in their early 40s who can't have children. For women, this is the end point where you can no longer cope about not being able to have kids. People are animals who are designed to breed first and be rational later, so over history, as you've removed reproductive ability, the society just falls apart. Also, there's this large bracket of men in their early 40s. When you're getting to that age, you stop being able to physically take the hardships of youth. A man in his 20s can work 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, survive off eating ramen, working odd jobs, and still has hope that things could get better. A man in his 40s who spent his life doing that without any hope of something better will start to radicalize and freak out since he knows he has no ability to retire. The big problem in Russia is a country with old demographics without anywhere near enough wealth to support a welfare state like Japan or Germany, who themselves can't support that. Ironically, the Russian data scientist Peter Turchin has developed metrics that can accurately predict when societies have revolutions. The top 3 metrics are inequality, wage stagnation, and too many elite aspirants, or more people trying to get to high social status than the society is capable of maintaining. All of these metrics are completely buzzing off for Russia right now. On top of this, there are secondary metrics such as average age of marriage, height, birth rate, university education, and more, all of which are also going off for Russia right now. Russia is statistically primed for a revolution or other kind of political crisis. The demographic I always look for revolutions is young men. Young men launch revolutions when they feel hopeless, sexually frustrated, and left out of the system. I see young men in Russia having the same problems today that they have in the rest of the world. These include lack of good jobs and the dating crisis, which I stand by as being the #1 driver of revolutions around the world today. In fact, I'd guess the dating crisis is worse in Russia than the West, due to higher inequality and feminism being weaker, thus allowing more polygamy and hypergamy among elite men. One of the things I find ironic that no one else has thought of is that for starting the Ukraine war, or if China or America have a war over Taiwan, all of these countries are basically signing their own suicide notes. What the Ukraine war's done is it's given Russian men of military fighting age, who are the target demographic for revolutions, military training, weapons, command structures, and a sense of shared struggle to unify them. The only real card the Russian government can pull at this point to motivate its population is Russian nationalism. The problem with that is that the Ukrainians are too ethnically close. As I've said in this video, the Russian-Ukraine war would be like if the Union was invading the Confederacy today. The North would see the South as an immutable part of their country, while the South would see itself as an independent nation that went back centuries. Both have legitimate arguments behind them. I support Ukraine since I support weakening America's rivals. Pulling on American nationalism wouldn't work for that kind of war, since they were fighting the ethnically identical Southerners. However, if you're a young guy in Russia today, you just don't remember the 90s, so Putin's big right to rule doesn't faze you. This is a trend we started seeing in 2011 with the Moscow protests, where the younger generation just didn't care that Putin was the hero of the 90s, which must be even more pronounced over a decade later. On top of this, as a young Russian man, you'd basically be looking forward to decades of being de facto slaves to the older generation in exchange for what exactly? On top of this, you're going to be used as cannon fodder in a useless war against your cousins. I think the Russian military will mutiny in the next few years, and this will be the spur for the collapse of Putin's Russia. We've already seen this partly with the failed Wagner coup. I was watching this video by Real Life Lore, where he makes the opposite case, that modern Russia is not on the verge of collapse. I really respect his argument for the opposite position, and I recommend you watch it after to hear the other side. However, he makes the valid point, which I wasn't able to believe at the time. Russia was able to successfully redirect its economy away from the West due to the sanctions relating to the Ukraine war to Asia. And it's meant Russia hasn't faced that bad economic losses from the Ukraine war. Russia has in effect become a mega North Korea, or a rogue actor against the American international order. However, since Russia is so dependent on foreign exports, it puts it in a really dangerous position. This is added to in that Russia's export routes are pretty unstable. As I've said many times before on this show, I make no pretensions to being correct in my predictions of the future, and I'm basically betting against God. Part of the reason the global famine I talked about hasn't occurred is that the Russians and Ukrainians were able to keep the Black Sea ports operating, allowing Africa and the Middle East to get the Russian and Ukrainian grain they're dependent upon for survival. This is a politically tense deal that could fall through at any time. On top of that, besides the Black Sea, which can be very easily blocked by Turkey, the US, or Ukraine, Russia's other ports such as St. Petersburg, Vladivostok, and Archangel all freeze over during the winter, meaning there is a real potential to just completely shut off Russian trade for months straight. This is also since it's incredibly difficult for the Russians to ship their goods through Asia by land. On top of this, the global market is just really tense right now. Russia now is completely dependent upon China, a country which in a couple other videos I've repeatedly said will collapse in a revolution over the next few years. During international secular cycles like ours, the normal thing is for massive price fluctuations. We've already been seeing this since COVID, and as the world gets crazier, so will this. The only thing Russia needs for complete social collapse is a drop in prices for its exports. Russia is in a weak position, and so if the economic glue that holds them together crashes, like resource prices normally do, but especially so in hard times, once the government can't pay its soldiers in the field, they mutiny. This has occurred before in Russia around World War I. At this point, Russia collapses into warlords. I'm going to make a future video about this at some point, but Russia is still a culturally unified country today. However, the project that modern Russia has been pushing since the Mongols, of unifying around an oppressive centralized government to fight outsiders more effectively, has broken Russia's spirit. What Russia needs to do to reunify and survive as a society is a revitalization of the church, whether orthodox or not. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the organization that has gained the most legitimacy and people by far has been the church. Russia went from an atheist to a strongly religious nation. Nations deal with trauma over history through religion. The idea of a loving spiritual world has allowed societies to put together the pain of horrifying trauma. Russia is a broken society, and its government is a representation of that. If Russia is to pull itself back together, it will need trust, and that comes from a shared mission. It's easy to forget that in the wars against the Mongols and Napoleon, the average Russian fought for the Orthodox Church first, not the monarch. I don't know if the Orthodox Church will be able to fill this spiritual void in Russia. Some other faith, or maybe even a completely new religion, might develop instead. But the void that is modern Russia creates the perfect conditions for a new cultural force, and as I've said in this video, potentially a new civilization. Be sure to watch my video on this topic once I release it.